Okay, so chapter 12, right? Chapter 12 is primarily about antebellum reforms. And that is, when we think about reforms, we want to say, changes to improve society. Right, changes to improve society. And again, antebellum meaning the time period prior to the Civil War. So chapter 10 was all the changes in the North. Chapter 11 was all the changes in the South. Both of these presented in some ways new problems. These were problems that society never had before. And so therefore, there needed to be sort of new solutions for that. The first part of chapter 12 talks a little bit about some of the cultural changes that take place. Sometimes we use this term romanticism or romantic. This sort of describes kind of like an artistic movement. We'll just call it a cultural movement. And, the best way that I can describe it, or the best way that I can identify it, is that it's a cultural movement that really wants sort of a return to nature. And, the best way to kind of think about it is that, especially in the North, where it's more intensely felt, you have this process of industrialization going on. Natural sources of power are being replaced. People are no longer, people still do, but it's not a matter of, riding a horse or having a wagon carried by an oxen, but now it's a matter of the steamship or the train. Cities are turned into, densely occupied areas, the concrete jungle, so to speak. And so this transformation from kind of like a more, having a connection with nature to losing that connection kind of pushes this artistic movement. And so you see a lot of romantic artwork or literature that is concerned with kind of reconnecting or returning to nature from society. There is an important intellectual movement that sort of stems off of this. For us, I'm not going to talk too much about like the painters and some of the other cultural aspects of this, but we'll talk about the Transcendentalists, which is sort of like a philosophical movement. And, for the Transcendentalists, really what they sort of emphasize is individualism. Kind of like, too, not necessarily a return to nature, but sort of a disconnect from society. This might especially be true if we think about, events like the market revolution, where farmers lost their self-sufficiency. The same thing would be true of urban workers, right? If you're a worker in a factory, you've sort of lost the ability to dictate when you can and cannot work. It's like what the Industrial Revolution did was to kind of plug everybody into the system. And as long as everybody played their part, they were all kind of parts in a machine. And so the Transcendentalists are more about sort of kind of disconnecting from this. Two of the more well-known Transcendentalist authors, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Emerson was known for publishing such works as, I believe, Self-Reliance. Also published a work called Nature. And again, both of these are associated with themes of individuality. They're also a little bit more spiritual in a certain sense, whereas you can think of society being overly concerned with things, with Enlightenment principles like things like reason and logic. What the Transcendentalists said, what kind of got lost in that was sort of the soul, so to speak. Henry David Thoreau is probably the most well-known Transcendentalist thinker. He famously wrote Walden, which was a story about him living in the woods for 2 years. So we might say about Henry David Thoreau attempted to reconnect with nature. Oops. I'll just say living in the woods. Right, and this was his book, Walden. And again, you can kind of see how that theme would, that sort of idea would be popular in a time period where the natural world is being just fundamentally altered and changed. The Industrial Revolution, in a lot of ways, is the moment where the natural world no longer shapes the human experience. It's human beings who actually shape the natural world, right? So even like today, and this is a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, we as human beings, we're not really shaped by our environment. I mean, we have the capacity as people, we have the technology to shape the environment to whatever our liking is. And what gets lost in that is kind of that, age-old connection with nature, with the soul, with things that are kind of unplugged from the system, so to speak. Another important contribution by Thoreau was this principle of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, in a sense, means to break immoral laws. I think immoral has two M's. I don't know. Break immoral laws. And civil disobedience was the answer to the question of, how to act in a corrupt / unjust society. Right? You can think about it from Thoreau's point of view. Population growth, immigration, everything in the industrial cities in the North are seemingly corrupt. They're full of sin. How does one lonely individual person, change an entire institution or an entire, legal system? And what Thoreau would say was, well, individuals have the responsibility to break any laws that are considered immoral or either unjust, right? So one great example was actually Thoreau himself when it came to the Mexican-American War. We'll talk about the Mexican War in 1846. We'll talk about it more in chapter 13. But essentially, this was a war in which Thoreau and others frankly believed was an unjust war. Right? So what does one single person do to protest an entire war? Thoreau simply refused to pay his taxes, right? And that was a way because he believed that the money that he paid in taxes was going to an unjust cause. And for that reason, he was put into prison for not paying his taxes. Well, that's about the best that you can do. Thoreau himself didn't really, he didn't really play a part in any mass movement, you might say, for justice, but his ideas certainly had influence, both in India by Gandhi, who practiced civil disobedience, and probably more well known in the case of the United States, Martin Luther King Jr., who also practiced the same thing. Both Gandhi and MLK consistently broke unjust laws, and they spent MLK and Gandhi, they practically lived in jail cells. Their entire careers. So that idea of civil disobedience, sometimes we associate this with nonviolence, right? To not use force to solve your problems, but again, to kind of, break laws, peacefully. Those ideas become very, very influential in the future. So that was one response, right? One response to the changes, especially in Northern society. I would say that the Transcendentalists as a movement, it was a New England movement, but that could resonate with a lot of Americans. On the other hand, there were some people who took more extreme measures. We would call these the Utopians, right? And a utopia is kind of like a perfect world. In fact, it's so perfect that it really can never exist. But the Utopians were much smaller in number, but more extreme. One example was Robert Owen. He was a factory owner. And his followers, sometimes called Owenites, were critical really of the capitalist system, right, or capitalism, critical of the way that workers worked in horrible working conditions, critical of the way of long hours, critical of child labor, critical of the living conditions under which people lived. And Robert Owen set up an experiment in which he created a factory system, created a space for his workers to live, which was, clean and safe, paid his workers a decent wage, provided adequate health care or child care, provided schooling for children. In other words, he created a humane factory system at a time period when it didn't exist. And he was, successful. I think his factory might have either been in Scotland or England. I don't recall exactly which country, but it was overseas. But his followers established an Owenite system in the United States, in New Harmony. So New Harmony was a what we might say a humane / communal factory. We'll call it a factory village, because factory villages were kind of areas where people lived and worked. And the idea was to not pay workers a wage, right? Because wages, or the suppression of wages, was something that was a problem, right? That is part of this capitalist system. But instead, workers come to work. They do what's required in the factory village. There's a communal store. Everybody takes what they need and leaves what they don't want, right? So it's like, it's this experiment, you might say, of communal living. Even though it had inspired, these sorts of experiments, ultimately the New Harmony experiment in Indiana did fail in the long run. There were specific things that contributed to it. So, for example, one of the questions, or one of the things that kind of held back the New Harmony experiment, was deciding who was going to do what work. So, for example, when it came to something like trash collection, nobody really wanted to do it. So they designated the little boys to collect all the trash, because little boys love playing in trash and they're dirty and they're smelly. So why don't they go ahead and do it? There's also another kind of saying that might have gone along with the experiment, and that was, everyone wanted to be a chef, but nobody wanted to be the cook. That, and again, that kind of gets to the same idea that some of the more undesirable jobs, it was hard to find people to do those jobs because, essentially there was no wage system, right? So if a job is undesirable, typically it demands higher wages, et cetera, et cetera. But what's interesting about Owen's critique, and in fact Owen's experiment and followers of him, is that, this is in a time period really before Karl Marx. This predates in a lot of ways the theory of communism, but it has, Owen and Marx both identify a lot of the problems with a growing industrial capitalist system. And in fact, a lot of these ideas about utopia end up being much more influential down the line. So again, very small group of people, but interesting idea in response to the changes in especially northern society. There were a few other more, again, sort of smaller, more extreme utopian communities. We'll just mention the Oneida and the Shakers. In this sense, both the Oneida and Shakers challenged traditional gender roles. You could think of both, all the utopians as kind of being like, what's wrong or what needs to be changed in modern, and by modern I mean, of course, antebellum society, in order to create a better world. Where, well, according to the Owenites, it's the economic system, right? That's the problem. And if you can change the economic system, if you can change worker exploitation and individual ownership, that's the solution. For the Oneida and the Shakers, it was more about changing the relationship between men and women, right? So gender roles typically refers to the relationship, not always the relationship, but certainly the expectations, but we'll just call relation between, men and women. So an issue for both the Oneida and the Shakers was monogamous marriage. Right? Monogamy is the practice of marriage with one husband, one wife. The Oneida instead opted for something they referred to as the Holy Family. And that was the idea that every man and every woman was married. Meaning, in this Holy Family, every man and every woman was free and open to have whatever type of sexual relationship they wanted with anybody else in the Holy Family. This would cut back on things like maybe not jealousy, but like, marriage being viewed as like a tool of ownership, right? That's what the Oneida community was practicing. They also had very, very strict policies when it came to who could and could not give birth. So we might say strict child policies. So, for example, it was dictated pretty much through a totalitarian system. Right? There's typically one person in charge of the Oneida community. It was dictated who could and could not have children. And if there were members of the community who were more desirable, they were allowed, whatever that meant to them, right? If there were those who were more desirable, they were allowed to have children, while other people were not. This was also a system that wasn't just challenging the principle of monogamous marriage, but in a sense was also challenging democracy by moving towards a more totalitarian approach. Again, those ideas gained traction, kind of like the ideas of Marx later on in the 20th century. Again, the Oneida, very small community, not very well viewed by a majority of the American public. In fact, many viewed the Oneida community as being just kind of like a bunch of perverts and engaging in constant orgies with one another. They were, the leaders were prosecuted multiple times, under various, laws that governed, sexual behavior, which were very much common at the time. The Shakers, though, again, a similar community, but they take a different approach. They also see the problem in society as being one defined by gender, the relationship with men and women. And instead, their solution is not just to have everyone marry everyone, but their solution is to practice complete celibacy, and that is to abstain completely from any type of sexual contact between men and women. And instead, all members of the Shaker community would be adopted. Unlike the Oneida, the Shakers, they were much more impressive to outsiders who were really impressed by the ability for, the Shakers to show kind of a very sort of strong discipline, right, from abstaining from any type of relation with one another. The men and women lived in separate barracks, right, in these communities, so they were completely separate from one another. And occasionally they would have a ceremony in which the men would be on one side of the room, the women on the other. They would do some dance where they would shake around a little bit, hence the term Shakers. And that was that, right? Now, again, when we think about these utopian communities, very interesting ideas maybe. Ideas that gain traction, later on. But we have to keep in mind that for most, actually we'll put this marriage. I don't even know if that's how you spell marriage, but that's fine. For most people, capitalism, democracy, and marriage, right? Those things were okay, right? For most reformers, those things are fine. It's, let's not take some of the fundamental pillars of society and, kind of rip them out from the foundation. Instead, let's keep things like capitalism, let's keep democracy, let's keep monogamy. But let's also make changes, right? And that's kind of where the reformers come in. They simply just want to make changes to that society. Another very important group that emerges in the antebellum period are the Mormons. The Mormons are a separate religious group. Something that's also worth mentioning is what's covered in a previous chapter, and that is something called the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening happens, the dates on it aren't really all that important, but it's happening in the antebellum period, 1810 to, 1850 or something like that. And just like the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening is a surge in religion, right? It's people becoming more religious, attending church once again. A very important part from the Second Great Awakening was individual salvation, the ability for people to sin, but then, kind of become, to absolve yourself from that sin. There was a certain sense of individual empowerment in the Second Great Awakening. It's like, yeah, okay, you may have messed up in the past, but you have the power to do good from now on, and you can still be saved. So start living a more religious and pious lifestyle. And that was, that was something that swept over, quote unquote, it burned over, they called it, burned over districts. That was where this religiosity kind of swept up. And again, people went to sermons. Again, recall that the Second Great Awakening was the Great Awakening in general was much more about emotion, or individualism, say salvation, right, was a part of it. And it was, in some sense, democratic. Again, religion is something that you feel, not that you think about. Mormonism is a religion that is founded in these similar circumstances. The founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, we'll call him the founder, created the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the Mormon Church. Joseph Smith grew up on a farm in New York that was going through the market revolution. And if we recall the market revolution, that was the transformation from, growing primarily to consume to growing to sell. And in this new competitive environment, lots of farms struggled to make that transition. And so this was in the midst of massive changes, not just in the way that people farmed, but also the changes in the way that society changed as well. And so, like many others, people look towards religious groups and religions as a mechanism to make sense of all the changes that had happened around them. A lot of people look towards the Second Great Awakening and some of these ideas, but Mormonism presented a different message. So, for example, instead of emotion, individual salvation, and democracy, Mormonism provided much more in the sense of order, to create an orderly society. Mormonism also preached a strong connection between church and state. Recall that after the American Revolution, the Enlightenment principle, or the Enlightenment idea of separation of church and state, resulted in pretty much every single state in the United States getting rid of official religions and public office being barred from having any sort of religious criteria. And then, you had all the changes and problems that happened to society, and a lot of Americans said, this is the problem, right? The reason why our society has gone astray, why there's crime in the cities and everything else that's being disrupted, is because the connection between church and state has been severed, and instead we need to reconnect that. Mormonism as a religion, again, provided a much more orderly system, right? There are certain leaders within the church, and it follows a structure, and structure was something that people sought in a chaotic time period. The religious text, the Book of Mormon. So this is the religious text of Mormonism. Joseph Smith was visited by the angel Moroni, who revealed to him the place of where the prophecy of these golden tablets were located. Joseph Smith dug them up and wrote the Book of Mormon. So not just the founder, but we'll also call him the prophet. And Joseph Smith preached a different version than mainstream Christianity, and this put the Mormons in opposition with a lot of their neighbors. Strictly a lot of Mormon persecution. It was an insistence of preaching the correct version of Christianity, but it was also the practice of polygamy, which put Mormons in opposition with their neighbors for the most part. Polygamy is the practice. Oops, how can I spell today? Practice of more than one wife. It was practiced by some of the leaders of the Mormon Church, not by many of the followers, but mostly the leaders. And it was reason to chase the Mormons out of, whatever town that they had, tried to establish a separate and, orderly society. Just to kind of give you an idea of the level of organizations the Mormons had. They even had their own militia as part of their community. But this persecution ultimately forced not only the Mormons to move multiple times, but Joseph Smith was killed by a riotous mob, ultimately leading the Mormons to migrate to a much more isolated location, and that was Salt Lake City, Utah. And that was to get really as far away and to as remote of a location as possible, and to build a separate community there. When Joseph Smith was killed, I believe he was killed in Illinois. Leadership passed to Brigham Young. So we might say about Brigham Young, he led Mormon migration to Utah, right? Mormonism is still very much a religion that is present today, even in the state of Utah. Very strong presence there, but not just in the United States, but all around the world. One important thing to take note of, again, there were a lot of various religious responses, but Mormonism is really, in some ways, the only purely American religion. Whereas, if you look at some of the other sects or denominations of Christianity, all of them have their origins, back in Europe. Mormonism is purely American in that sense, but since then has been exported well beyond the borders of the United States to other places as well. So again, you can think about all of these things, right? Whether it's a return to religion, the creation of new religious groups, looking for ways to fundamentally change, society for the better, or trying to reconnect with nature or reconnect with your soul, or kind of emphasize individuality. All of these things are against the backdrop of what we talked about in chapter 10, where society is being completely turned on its head, right? The rate and pace at which things are changing are really hard to take grip of, right? So any questions about some of the cultural movements, religious movements, or utopian movements?
I actually do.
Sure.
Only asking because I did read a book about the FLDS cult. I thought that Mormonism did not believe in polygamy, and the reason why there was a separate church called the FLDS was so they could practice polygamy And so I'm just a bit confused about that, because I thought the reason why there is a whole different separate religion based off Mormonism was so they can practice polygamy, because the original Mormons did not believe in that.
Yeah, it's definitely a controversial topic. And to be 100% honest, I'm not entirely sure of, kind of the ins and outs of it. I know that at the very least, historically speaking, that regardless of the practice of it, who practiced it, and who did not, the at the very least, the allegations of polygamy put Joseph Smith and other leaders of the Mormon Church at odds with with their neighbors. It was reason for Joseph Smith to be arrested on occasions. It was reasons for them to be pushed from one city to another. There were multiple cities that the Mormons sought to inhabit before they finally moved to Utah. So I just don't know enough, I think, to answer your question. But at the very least, I can say that the accusation of polygamy was reason for their movements throughout the United States and eventually to Utah.
Right. No, I haven't read the book in a while, but I think what I think might have happened was it was because I remember Joseph Smith did believe in that, and I think after some new leaders took over after he was killed, they tried to change back to monogamy, and then the original people who wanted to practice polygamy decided to
Broke off.
break off, create the Feminist Church of Latter-day Saints, and move. I think it was like more south of Utah is where they went. But yeah, that's why I got a bit confused.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that could be entirely, you could be recalling it correctly. I don't know enough about the specifics to be able to kind of say either way.
No, thank you. I appreciate
You're
it.
welcome. Any other questions? That's a good question. Okay, so for the most part, like we said, the chapter that what we're really focusing on here are the reform movements, and those would be the people wanting to change society, not really get rid of the fundamental pillars here like the Utopians did. And when it comes to reform movements, there's going to be four major movements, or kind of four movements that we'll identify. Four reforms, right? Changes to society. And then those reforms leading to a women's rights movement, which is kind of like a reform movement, but also a little bit different. So 4 reforms plus a women's rights movement. So, and one thing to also take note of in terms of Remaking Society, that for the most part, these are reforms that are taking place in the North, right? Because a lot of these newer problems really characterize what's going on in the North. The first one to identify is temperance. The temperance movement is to ban alcohol, right? Ban alcohol. And if you were a reformer in the antebellum period in the North, urbanization brought with it new problems of drinking or new patterns of drinking. It wasn't that alcohol was new. It wasn't that people were drinking more of it. People had always drank a lot, especially in the United States. But in a rural and spread out environment, it really didn't pose a lot of problems if people were just drinking in their homes, right? Sort of spread out from everyone else. It became a much bigger problem with the growth of urbanization and the growth of cities. Now you had alcohol affecting familial relationships, alcohol affecting the workplace, alcohol affecting the public square. And you combine that with the market revolution. Again, the market revolution is, we'll just go over here a little bit. right? So we'll call this the new drinking patterns, right? So what's new is not, like I said before, it's not that people just started drinking all of a sudden. Alcohol had always existed. It was, the urbanization, the fact that people were much closer. So now it becomes a big, now it is an issue if your neighbor drinks all day, because they are now affecting, you, because they live in close proximity, whereas in other cases it's not a problem. It was also the market revolution, right? And that was when commodities went from consumption to sale, and this included alcohol. So whereas before people were drinking alcohol they made themselves, they weren't very good at making it. Now they're drinking and consuming, they're buying it rather than making it. And by buying it, you can get kind of a much better quality and get much stronger stuff. So the culture and the patterns around drinking stay the same in some cases, but it's the type of alcohol that's being consumed that ends up being different. So public drunkenness is an issue. Like I said, drunk in the workplace. It should also be mentioned, and you may have got this from your source, right? If you read Lehman Beecher, alcoholism was very closely tied also to immigration. We talked about in a previous chapter. Of course, immigrants brought their drinking cultures to the United States, but the point is that a drinking culture had already existed in the US, right? It wasn't new. Many times immigrants were just made the scapegoat of alcoholism. And so there was a huge movement to get rid of alcohol in the United States with some success. A lot of local battles being fought. Here is probably one of the more well-known reformist pieces of literature, or not literature, but it's a temperance cartoon. And this was one of the ways that temperance reformers tried to get people on their side and to vote to ban alcohol. And to be, if you were just to simply look at industrial society and say, well, if we get rid of alcohol, things would get better, that's a pretty reasonable stance to take. It doesn't seem like in any way, shape, or form alcohol is helping anything. And you can kind of see the step, right? That on the one hand, a few drinks will kind of get you to a nice and happy place where you're all jolly with your friends, but if you keep doing it, pretty soon you're ended up in this guy's killing himself in suicide. And then of course you see here especially the impact that it has on the family. And this is going to be something very important to note about these reform movements. And I think this illustration does a good job of pointing it out. And this will be true of all the reform movements, and that is the role that women play in all of these movements. Because recall, we're still talking about a time period where women are denied the right to vote, they're denied the right to hold public office. And so if there's a problem in society, or if there's a problem in your community, there's no avenue to vote, there's no avenue to run for office, so what do you do to solve this problem? Well, the answer is to join a reform movement, right? Go out and hand out pamphlets, give speeches, try to influence, hold meetings, right? Publish things like this in, in the newspaper. And that becomes, an avenue for, for change, right? For change. So temperance is one. Now, when it comes to the national prohibition of alcohol, that doesn't happen until 1920. It's not covered in this class. But, really from the 1850s onwards, for about 70 years, you had wets and dries. Wets were people who favored alcohol consumption. Dries were people who did not favor it. Wets and dries really kind of like battled it out in a state-by-state, city-by-city effort to try to get rid of alcohol. And what's interesting, what a lot of people don't know, is that, when 1920 rolled around, when alcohol was banned in the entire United States in 1920, it was already banned in half the country at that point. Half the country had already made alcohol illegal before it was made on an entire federal level. All right, so that is reform movement number one. Reform movement number two, education, specifically public education. And what we mean by this is tax funded schools. Right, Horace Mann, probably the most famous and most effective school reformer. We'll just say famous school reformer. And this was especially true in the North, right? And there were a lot of reasons as to why people supported tax-funded schools. We're talking mostly like elementary, kind of like middle schoolish sort of age schools here. By the time of the Civil War, pretty much every single northern state has public education. And that wasn't the case following the American Revolution, right? That was a process, that was a reform that took place. What did education solve? Well, it solved a couple of things. It solved the problem, in some cases, of child labor. All right, let kids go to school rather than working in the factories. It solves the problem of child homelessness, right? Maybe crime as well. And one thing that we typically don't associate with schools, but in fact, the very first schools or public schools ever established were established for this reason. And that was to create a sense of nationalism. All right, schools are a major institution of nation building. We think about schools as a place we go to learn our ABCs and our 1, 2, 3s and maybe get an education and get a job. But many of the first schools back in like the late 1800s were created to turn essentially like, farmers, rural folk, hill people, right? To turn them into nationalists, turn them into Americans. And this fits very well with the trends of the time period, and that's immigration. And that there are, hundreds of thousands of people coming to the United States that don't know what it means to be an American. How do you go from, a German to an American or an Irish to an American? Well, you go to school. And they tell you the history of the United States. They show you the flag. They show you the map. And, by the time you're out, you're not an immigrant anymore. You're still an immigrant, but, you've now been instilled with a sense of nation, of unity. And, that was one of the reasons why people supported public education, especially in the North. So that's reform number 2. Right? Reform number 3. We'll go ahead and call it the prison systems or criminal justice. Rehabilitation. All right, so we might say change in criminal justice. And really the change was from punishment, a system that strictly sought to punish people for their crimes, to essentially like a rehab. Punishment or crime in criminal justice was very much uneven. It was very much local. And it wasn't really that effective, or at least it wasn't perceived as effective. Remember, crime in the cities in the industrial period was a big, big problem. So with crime on the rise, the question is, well, what do you do? And the answer is to change the prison system. So for example, punishment for various crime before some of these changes, before some of these reforms, might just be like 10 lashings, right? You steal something, you get 10 lashes. They whip you 10 times or whatever it is. Or do what the Puritans did and, stick you in one of those devices out in the public square so everybody can kind of publicly humiliate you. Prison systems were transformed to sort of, instill a sort of work discipline. It's really kind of where we get the modern prison system today, right? Think about this thing here. There were kind of 2 ways of punishing people, right? You could use physical punishment, or you could just throw them in a dungeon and lock away the key. Those systems eventually died out, and instead you had a system in which prisoners were required to wake up at a certain time, required to make their beds, required to socialize, eat in a cafeteria, required to work while they were in prison. And the idea was sort of setting a very strict regiment for prisoners, whatever the crime may be, would, rehabilitate that person so they can go back into society again, right? And that's part of what the criminal justice system is. It's not only punishment, but it's also rehabilitation. And it was very popular. and it was more effective than the other types of prison systems. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't it wasn't necessarily a humane system, right? If you were if you didn't wake up at the proper time, physical violence would be used against you, right? Violence was certainly used to coerce behavior. But after going through it a number of years, you would come out a model citizen, right? Or essentially that was the idea. Another way that prison reform changed was maybe more compassion for those who were mentally ill. The establishment of asylums, so these were institutions for the mentally ill. Before, there was no special treatment for those who were mentally ill. They were simply just thrown into the what you might say regular prison population. Dorothea Dix was a major prison reformer, right? So she was, we'll call her a criminal justice reformer. She's responsible for having established a number of asylums, and sometimes is used as the example of the new, sometimes referred to as the public woman. And again, that is somebody who is making their voice heard in public in a time period when the laws, the culture, the society, and the stereotypes said that there were two distinct separate spheres, public and private, and women only have control over the private domain. Again, this is working beyond simply just working with the prohibitions on voting and other things in mind. So right there, 3 changes, 3 reforms to make society for the better: get rid of alcohol, create public education for kids, and change the criminal justice system to try and cut down on crime. The 4th reform we're going to talk about at the very end. That is the Abolitionist Movement. It is the most relevant to our class because it has the most immediate impact. But one thing that I do want to talk about first is the rise of women's rights, or the rise of feminism, and its relationship to these reform movements. Again, you can think about the women's rights, or the first women's rights movement, as emerging out of these various reform movements. Now, there were women writers who were talking about notions of education and citizenship prior to this. We've even talked about some of them in this class, especially one in the Enlightenment era, when there were new definitions about what it meant to be a citizen belonging to one's nation. But a good way of kind of thinking about the rise of women's rights, especially in the United States, is to begin first with reform movements. And that is to say that in all of these reform movements, the temperance movement, the movement for public education, the movement for criminal justice, there were also other reform movements that we didn't mention specifically, but moral reform movements. There were reform movements that were only women's movements, that only had women as members. Moral reform would be like anti-prostitution, anti-gambling, anti any type of immoral behavior. Many of these women, especially in the abolitionist movement, faced criticism from their male counterparts. Some great examples include Sarah and Angelina Grimke. All of these women here, Sarah, Angelina, Elizabeth, and Susan B. Anthony, these are all pioneers on women's rights. All of them were reformers, right? All of them were reformers first. Sarah and Angelina, they were Quakers, and they spoke out against slavery, right? They were anti-slavery. And there was something unique about the Quaker religion. We talked about this a long time ago, but generally speaking, Quakers had a much stronger sense of equality between men and women, inside and outside the church. And Sarah and Angelina Grimke were, welcome to speak out in front of groups of Quakers, but when they started making speeches to other audiences, they found themselves not preaching the evils of slavery, but instead having to defend themselves as women speakers. And so they came to the realization that a lot of other people did. Susan B. Anthony, I think she was a Temperance. I think she was anti-alcohol reformers. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was also an abolitionist. They found themselves saying, well, if they can't even gain an audience, then yes, abolishing slavery is important, but the more important thing here is women's rights in general. Stanton, who you see pictured, I believe that's Stanton right there, who you see pictured there, she traveled as an abolitionist. She traveled all the way to London to attend an anti-slavery exposition. And when she got there, they wouldn't let her in because she was a woman. They would only let in men. And that became, for her anyways, kind of like the light bulb moment, so to speak. And so a lot of other like-minded women who had experiences in public life and various reform movements met in Seneca Falls in 1848, created the Declaration of Sentiments, which was a manifesto based on the Declaration of Independence. I think somebody actually presented the Declaration of Sentiments as their primary source. And this was done intentionally, right? To quite literally take Thomas Jefferson's word and to say, all men and women, right? To add men and women. And instead of, the Declaration of Independence, which we got to read a little bit of it in this class, is pretty much a list of all the ways that Great Britain oppressed the colonies. The Declaration of Sentiments is all the ways in which men oppress women. And what was very important coming out of the Seneca Falls Convention was kind of the way in which progress on women's rights was defined, because there were a lot of different ways in which women were getting the short end of the stick. But the way that it was defined at the convention and the way that it really characterized the women's rights movement from that point onward was in terms of suffrage. And that was the right to vote, right? The right to vote. And that's what was demanded. And so from that movement onwards, the right to vote really became the goal. So, this happened in 1848. Federal women's suffrage, so the point in which women in every state could vote, that didn't happen until 1920. So this would be a movement that was much longer, right? A much longer and drawn out process. But at the same time, a lot of the earliest pioneers, we're looking at women's issues from a particular racial and class and religious perspective. There were others who advocated for the rights of Black women. Sojourner Truth is one of the most well-known ones. She was a former slave. Former slave turned reformer. She was an abolitionist and women's rights advocate. And one of the things that she pointed out, and this was true in a lot of some of the other movements, especially the abolitionist movement, what she pointed out was that for slaves, there was no distinction between what was considered men and women's work. Men and women were forced to perform labor under the threat of violence and under violence in slavery in the South. Whereas in a lot of these reform groups, whether it was education, rehabilitation, whatever it was, oftentimes the issues of women's rights would kind of get in the way of these other reformist issues. So, for example, this isn't exactly relevant to our particular class, but if you take the second part of U.S. history, one of the debates being had was, should those suffragettes, and a suffragette is somebody who supports women's suffrage, should they support the right for Black men to vote? And that was a controversial topic because in some ways, some viewed it as women's rights being explicitly ignored, and others viewed it as kind of a gradual process. And Truth tried to really settle this by encouraging, speaking about her experiences as a slave, where there was no idea of separate spheres, right, in slavery, encourage men and women to work together. and she was one of the more well-known abolitionists. All right, so, four reform movements: temperance, education, prison, abolition. We'll finish with the abolitionist movement here. But again, all of those giving rise to the rise of the first feminist movement or the first women's rights movement. Any questions on the reforms so far outside of the abolitionist movement? Okay. So abolitionism is going to be for us the most relevant one here, because our class concludes with the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. And it's going to play a very strong role in the outbreak of the Civil War, which is just on the horizon. Now, abolitionism is going to be defined in a very specific way here. So it's good to know the difference. So I'm going to try to use these terms consistently, but I already know that I won't. So opposition to slavery won't necessarily mean abolitionism, right? We'll also call this anti-slavery. All right, to be anti-slavery is pretty straightforward. You'd be somebody against slavery, right? Seems pretty obvious. Well, how can abolitionism be different? Well, abolitionism is different in that it's a social reform movement, right? So it's a movement, there's some sort of organization there. Right, so one good example of anti-slavery were people like Quakers, right? Quakers were anti-slavery because it was against their religious views, but we wouldn't say that the Quakers were an abolitionist organization. They were a religion, right? They were a religion first, but because of their religious views, they held anti-slavery positions. But it's not as if, the entire purpose of Quakerism is to get rid of slavery in the United States. It's much bigger than that, right? Abolitionism is a specific reform movement in the antebellum period, so it doesn't exist after the Civil War. But their demands there are two specific demands that they have. One is to end slavery now, right? Immediately, right? So we wouldn't consider anybody who doesn't call for an immediate end to slavery an abolitionist. Right, that means no gradual emancipation, no compensated emancipation. Well, maybe compensated emancipation, but an immediate end to slavery. And then after that, what the abolitionists want is full integration for former slaves. Right, for former slaves. And what that means is that once slavery is abolished, those people who were previously enslaved become American citizens, are granted the, all the protections of the Bill of Rights, granted legal protections. They essentially are Americans. And this clashed with earlier notions of anti-slavery, specifically the American Colonization Society, which is one of the first anti-slavery organizations. And what the Colonization Society proposed was an ending to slavery, but then rather than slaves be integrated into American society, former slaves be resettled in Liberia. So this was a colony in Africa for former slaves. All right, colony in Africa for former slaves. And the Colonization Society was widely supported by a lot of mainstream politicians, right? Like your Andrew Jacksons, your James Monroes. I don't know about some of the earlier ones, the Jeffersons and whatnot, but certainly some of the more mainstream politicians supported this policy, right? They feared integration, didn't have any desire to extend rights and citizenship. So these types of organizations existed, right? The Quakers were there, the Colonization Society was there, but we wouldn't completely identify them as being purely abolitionists. Another thing that marks an abolitionist, and again, here's where you might get a little bit more depending on how loosely you want to define the movement, is the use of violence. In general, abolitionists were non-violent. So, for example, somebody like David Walker, who was a black abolitionist, somebody who advocated for violence. We might not consider somebody like David Walker. He was a black man living in Boston in the North, and he encouraged slaves to rise up and kill their masters. Again, depending on sort of how we want to define. I know that he's listed as an abolitionist here, but generally we would say that abolitionism called for a non-violent end to it. The most well-known, maybe not the most well, yeah, probably the most well-known at the time, was William Lloyd Garrison. He was the publisher of the Liberator. The Liberator was an abolitionist newspaper. Right. Here's the Liberator right here. I don't think I actually have a picture of Garrison, but he's a, no, I don't. But he's a bald guy with glasses. He was the most controversial. He was a lightning rod. He was the guy who would get like the most public attention. One example was that he would burn copies of the Constitution in public, and that was because the Constitution had sanctioned slavery. And so he would talk or advocate about getting rid of the U.S. Constitution. And, when you burn the U.S. Constitution in public, you're bound to make some people angry. On one occasion, William Lloyd Garrison was dragged throughout the streets by his neck, with a rope around his neck, nearly killed until a police officer arrested him. But the Liberator gave a voice to, to people, and presented an audience with, showing and proving the evils of slavery. Other abolitionists, Sojourner Truth, we talked about her earlier. She was a former slave. One of the most effective tools of the abolitionists was speaking to experience and playing on emotion. Right? To have somebody who had experienced slavery firsthand, like Sojourner Truth, she could not only talk about, slavery, but she could also talk specifically about slavery as a woman, having your child ripped from your arms, being sexually assaulted. Those were things that Frederick Douglass, who was the most well-known abolitionist, I would say. This is Douglass down here. Truth could speak to some issues that Douglass couldn't speak to. Right. But Douglass, also former slave in Maryland, escaped, said that one of the most profound experiences in his life was when he was sent to what was called a slave breaker. And a slave breaker was somebody who tried to break kind of the spirit of slaves who were not obedient enough, using violence. I think he was only 15 years old when he went through that experience. And, he said that from that moment on that he would dedicate his, the rest of his life to taking down the institution. He eventually, I think he actually escaped. Douglass did, made his way to the North, and became really, like a world famous abolitionist. Douglass was. Again, he could speak about personal experience. He wrote about it. It's one thing for a guy like Garrison, who's actually never been a slave, to talk about the evils of slavery. It's another thing for people who have actually gone through it. One of his most probably well-known speeches is the 4th of July speech. And in that speech, I think, he poses the question, what does the 4th of July mean for slaves? It's a time period when everybody else is celebrating the independence of the country. But what does it mean for those who are in bondage? And, it's not a primary source that we have for any of our, essay assignments or writing assignments. But if you're interested, you can see what Frederick Douglass has to say about that. Right? What to the slave does the 4th of July mean? Much like when it came to other reform movements, there was opposition to it, but quite not the same degree as there was to the abolitionist movement. And one of the things that we've got to realize about this particular time period is that slavery was the issue. I don't mean slavery was an issue. Slavery was the issue. It was the issue that threatened to break the country apart. And so for every abolitionist that talked more and more and more about ending slavery, that was a wedge that would be further driven between the northern and southern parts of the country. And so there were efforts on all sides to try and diminish the influence of abolitionists no matter where they were. The abolitionists were remarkable. They were a very small group. They were one of the only racially integrated groups in the United States. And, the tactics that they used, holding public meetings, mailing campaigns was a big one, threatened to undermine the entire nation, right? The more vocal that they were. Elijah Lovejoy, he was an abolitionist publisher. So we'll say abolitionist. He was killed by a mob who had previously burned down his printing press like 5 times. And when he went to go out to defend it on the 6th time, he was killed. So Elijah Lovejoy became a martyr for the abolitionist cause. It was such a problem, in fact, that even the talk about abolitionism was such a problem that during Jackson's presidency, Congress made it illegal to talk about abolitionism, because that's once you brought up the topic of slavery, suddenly everybody in the room knew what side that they were on, and that was North versus South. Talk a lot more about that at on chapter 13. But there were continued instances in which people, you gradually see this shift to people moving more towards the abolitionist cause. The Amistad Case, I think we actually talked about this in a previous chapter, right? This was a slave ship permitted by the U.S. to go free. If you don't recall, the Amistad was a slave ship, I believe Cuban. The slaves rose up, took over the ship when the U.S. captured it, and it became a huge case. And the controversy was, should these slaves go free or should they be put back into bondage? And the U.S. Supreme Court, with the help of former President John Quincy Adams, said that they should go free because of the international slave trade, or the Atlantic slave trade, was prohibited. The contemporary political parties of the time, the Whigs and the Democrats. Remember, it's been a long time since we talked about our Whigs and our Democrats, but our test is coming up, so this will be a good chance to review it. Remember, our Democrats were pro-Andrew Jackson, our Whigs were anti-Andrew Jackson. In that sentiment, there was really no place for Northerners and Southerners. So there were some Whigs from the North, there were some Whigs from the South, there were some Democrats from the North, there were some Democrats from the South, right? And this was the case pretty much from the time of Jackson, which was, 1824 was when he ran his first campaign, all the way until about the 1850s. Because once the issue of slavery gets brought up, right? Well, then everybody knows who people are voting for, right? The South is voting in favor of slavery, and the North is voting against it. So when the Whigs and Democrats would hold their political party platforms, when they'd hold their meetings, when they would create what they stood for, neither party would talk about their position on slavery, right? They just didn't want to talk about it, because if it got brought up, it would not only rip the country apart, but it would rip the current political system apart, which eventually it did, right? Which was one of the contributing factors to the Civil War. And so people who wanted abolitionism went off and created their own party, right? The Liberty Party was an abolitionist Political party, right? Very small. Again, people not satisfied with either Whigs or Democrats. Free Soilers, we'll call this an anti-slavery political party. They oppose slavery really on economic reasons, right? Free soil means areas that slavery is prohibited, right? They created a political party, the Free Soilers. A lot of times these were immigrants, these were whites who were living in the North, I mean, even free blacks, but they wanted to ban slavery because wherever slavery was legal, jobs would be more difficult to find, right? Slavery suppressed wages. Why hire somebody to do it when they could just buy a slave and force them to do it? And so Free Soilers were a group or an organization that opposed slavery on purely economic grounds, right? They may have moral objections, but a lot of the Liberty Party joined the Free Soilers. A lot of people in the Abolitionist movement voted for the Free Soil Party, right? Another important abolitionist, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, so wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? And Uncle Tom's Cabin was a novel which told the evils of slavery. Very, very important. It was the most widely read book prior to the Civil War. And, reading was what people did for fun, is what they did for leisure. Today we might, go watch a movie or, turn on Netflix or something like that. Back then there's, no electricity. So what people read, and people read novels, they read books. And so a lot of people picked up Uncle Tom's Cabin to read it for the entertainment value, right? Because they would get a good story. And in that book, what Stowe did, you might notice the last name Beecher. She was the daughter of the preacher Lyman Beecher, which you have for your primary source. In fact, because the church prohibited women from being preachers, Harriet became an author instead, right? Rather than joining the clergy. But people picked up this book and, were revealed in a way that, the evils of slavery that they weren't aware of before. You might say to yourself, how could one not be aware of this? Recall that for the Northerners, and this is really a difficult trick that the abolitionists have to do, is they have to convince a Northern audience. This makes the abolitionist reform more difficult than anything else. If you're a Northerner and you walk outside in an industrial city, you see the problem of drunkenness right in front of you, right? The drunk person is right on your doorstep. You see the problem of no education for children. You experience child labor. You see children wandering the streets. You see the crime. But there's nobody in the North that walks out of their door and sees the problem of slavery right in front of them. Unless you actively went out to research what life was like for slaves in the antebellum period, you would be oblivious to it. And that's what the abolitionists wanted to change. They wanted to go out there and make people aware of it. And so in some ways, you could say Uncle Tom's Cabin was a way to reveal to a much broader audience the evils of slavery and convince people that they needed to do something about it, right? And again, it's slavery had existed before this period, but there's, of course, what's happening is that slavery it's growing at a rapid rate. We talked about this in chapter 11, right? The number of slaves is growing, and where slavery is spreading is growing, right? So again, in terms of thinking about what changed between these years, again, focusing on that point. Lastly, I'll just mention John Brown. We'll talk about John Brown again. He is a violent anti-slavery. He leads a slave revolt. I'll just say person for now. I'll talk more about John Brown. You don't have to know a lot about him now, but he leads an unsuccessful slave revolt. He, uses violence. He murders pro-slavery opponents. We'll talk more about him anyways. Okay.